Alright. For most of my adolescence, I was a downer. Not a huge one, just one. There's tidbit number one for you. You are absolutely not a huge downer. If you're thinking of yourself as both large and negative, then you are definitely engaging in some kind of shadow ego, right? Large and positive is full-on narcissism. And small and negative is empty out detachment. But large and negative is already a condition that screams made up by the subject's own ego, because it's inconsistent in first principles. Thinking you're a huge downer is convincing yourself that your effect on the world is at least huge. That's you locking your negative reinforcement in place using positive reinforcement. I probably don't need to explain how mental that is. I've already got sidetracked on my first sentence. That's self-examination for you. Cut. Right. For most of my adolescence, I was a downer. Not a huge one, just one. I felt generally sorry for myself, and on the rare occasions I spoke, it was all too often to feel sorry for myself out loud. And we write this off as being typical of teenagers, of puberty. But a quick look at teenagers in the kind of countries where teenagers are people who've been working for half their lives, you'll find they're often more centred and level-headed than your average middle-aged Western roly-poly. I think this tendency to feel sorry for yourself is... Well, it sometimes comes down to medical conditions, and sometimes it's simply down to just personality. But those are relatively rare exceptions. And maybe I'm just a dodgy personality, but I don't know. But since I've taken steps to grow out of my bullshit, I've tried, wherever possible, I say tried, I very much can't help it sometimes, to tap into the memories of why on earth that happened in my personality. And indeed why it seems to happen in so many people's personalities. For my entire adolescence, in my case pretty much 12 till, I'll say 21 for the sake of argument, I felt sorry for myself. And feeling sorry for yourself is a pretty good synonym for thinking like a victim. And I reckon that's the crux of the problem. I reckon that's what we're looking at. Not what leads to thinking like a victim, and not what leads from thinking like a victim, but the act itself of thinking like a victim. Thinking that you're unlucky to be you. I think you know what I mean by these definitions. Thinking you're unlucky to be you. The most inspirational stories we hear often come from people who have faced the most unimaginable tragedies, losses, disabilities, and have, nevertheless, against all odds, risen to success. And what they all have in common is they never think, or at least they come to stop thinking, that they are unlucky to be them. That they are victims of nature. On the bloody contrary. You can only lose so many blessings before you learn to appreciate them. One look at a Paralympic event will show you people who quite frankly make nonsense of the word victim. By all accounts, every Paralympian is a victim, an actual victim of an actual tragedy. But do those look like victims to you? Do they act like victims? This, weirdly, is sort of how you can sometimes spot the telltale differences between someone who is mopey and someone who is clinically depressed. Between someone who is moody and someone who is bipolar. A person who has been to the depths brought on by measurable neural compromise, that person is, for the most part, thankful to be back to normal. Right? They'll treat most of life's quirks with some kind of obtuse enthusiasm. It's that lament you get when you have a cold, or when you're ill with anything. You realise how much you take it for granted that you're healthy most of the time. People who are just mopey, just moody, are generally like that all the time. That's what happens if you have highs but no lows. If you keep firing forward, you're going to get some lasting kickback. Moody people wear their darkest emotions on their sleeve because their emotions aren't particularly dark and they've never been strangled by them into a helpless, embarrassing submission of will. And I went through something a bit like that when I was. Well, that doesn't matter. As far as I know, right? As far as I know, I could have just been one of the moody people. When I tap into the memory, it sure kind of looks like that. And in any case, that's how I choose to see it, because thinking like a victim is out of the question. Even if you are, in fact, a victim of something. Seeking help isn't out of the question. Seeking help within reason is never out of the question. Needing help doesn't make you a victim. But thinking you couldn't be helped, or can't be helped, does make you think like a victim. If you can point to an event, a loss or a tragedy, then obviously that's what makes you technically a victim. But if all you can point to is yourself, the way you are, if you think you're a victim because of an intrinsic part of yourself that you can't change, then you are self-victimizing. You have locked yourself into a vicious circle that's highly destructive to you and quite destructive to others. I honestly think most adolescent neuroses, ranging from the most minor to the most serious non-medical issues, can in some part be traced to victim culture. Victim culture hasn't sprung out of nowhere. Obviously, it's part of human nature. In fact, it's part of animal nature. It's the flight in fight or flight. It's what happens when there's nowhere to fly to. And since we humans we're unique in our comprehension and our articulation of the self, we have manifested the fight or flight instinct in this twisted, abstract amalgamation of fight and flight. It's called complaining. It's called whinging. It's called victim culture. The simplest, most effective ideas win out, both genetically and socially and politically. It's not the best ideas that win. It's not the most humane ideas. It's not the ideas that lead to the most net happiness. It's simply the ideas that propagate most promiscuously in their environment. And victim culture can propagate anywhere. Anywhere where there's a nugget of difference between one or more parties. Two or more parties. Let's say you have three people engaging in a conflict. Persons A, B, and C. Person C then claims that they are the one being hurt by the conflict. Person B looks at their choices. Either they can continue to try and resolve the conflict on its terms, or they can do what person C just did. They just jump into the victim box and claim to be absolved of responsibility for any mistaken hand in the conflict. Person B then does so and claims that the conflict is hurting them too. It's now two victims against one perpetrator, person A. So person A, naturally, is now eliminated from the argument for basically not putting his finger on his nose and saying, Bagsy, not the bad guy. Now B and C can either go back to try and resolve this conflict on its terms, forgetting that they just eliminated a player on completely different terms, or, more commonly, they can then go on to argue about who is the real victim, rather than actually resolving the conflict. It's an argument that leads not to victory as the goal, but victimry. In any case, all three people will go away understanding the victim card, and how effective a strategy it is, especially if your aim is just to get out of an argument instead of actually have it. It turns out, in most real-life, modern-day average Joe arguments, the logic card is worth scarcely 10% of what the victim card is. So the first person to play the victim card is probably going to win the game. Needless to say, certain fairly large factions of our society have the victim card face up in front of them at all times, but I will endeavour to stick to the point. It may not have always been like this. I mean, history is full of examples. It's pretty much full of nothing but examples of people being victimised en masse. Poor people. But did those people, at that time, think of themselves as victims? No. Usually no. Because they had shit to be getting on with. When there are massive bits of wood and metal to be clanked around all day, the victim card doesn't mean shit. Unless, of course, you're a wealthy snob. in which case you can play it to keep the oiks in check. The phrase, "how dare you speak to me like that," is the victim card. And in the West, in the last half century, the average person has enjoyed a life as decadent as any Georgian socialite. Especially children. Especially teenagers. The average person is not given anything important to do for the sake of any other human being until they are in their late teens or early 20s. We spend 20 years living the life of medieval princes and princesses, surrounded by other medieval princes and princesses. Is it any wonder the victim card has been processed into our culture? There's a brilliant quote by Alice Thomas Ellis. "There is no reciprocity. Men love women, women love children, children love hamsters." This has become truer and truer as our society has become safer and safer. The smaller, cuter, and less threatening a creature looks, the more it is worshipped. That's what we admire now. We admire helplessness instead of helpfulness, innocence instead of experience, lambs instead of tigers. We no longer celebrate the victorious, we celebrate the victimorous. Term coinage. Awesome. So, as children, we grow up in a world where smallness, cuteness, and innocence are worshipped. A world where being a victim, or even a potential victim, is worshipped. And then we become grown-ups. Even by the age of 5, we notice that we're starting to get less attention than babies. And by the time puberty kicks in, we've become a rotting mess of an animal. You could only be 5 feet tall, and you could have beautiful skin, but to yourself, you will always be the monster that grew out of that child, of your pure form. You'll never get that worship back, unless you cling to it psychologically. Cling to it for dear life. If you can't look like a victim, then you can at least act like one, and think like one. And you cry for help. Like I say, asking for help that you need is perfectly reasonable. But what we do when we're adolescent and fucked up is not only do we cry for help that we don't need, we more often than not cry quietly to ourselves. We actually hide the cry for unnecessary help. Partly because deep down perhaps we know it's unnecessary and we're not doing it for the sake of the help, we're doing it for the sake of the cry. And I can hardly fault that. Sometimes you've got to cry. But you've got to have a good reason to cry. Because if you can't find a good reason, it's probably because, like I just garrulously explained, you're probably clinging onto a thread of victim worship. One that served you so well as a child that it seems unfair that it doesn't work anymore. So my advice to society is, how about we get back to worshipping impressive creatures instead of bug-eyed little fat ones? How about those big, ugly, slightly cranky, slightly tired men and women who get up early in the morning to go out and build a fucking society? How about giving them some love once in a while instead of pouring all your affection into barely conscious critters that lie around eating and sleeping all day? How about we take images of zitty, sweaty, socially awkward young people and slap them all over the media and say these people are cool too? Because you've never actually thought of that, have you? You put nothing but good-looking, inoffensive, cute people all over every nook and cranny, and then you wonder why the average teenager feels like a failure in their very identities. To quote John Gomm, "You are what you grow into, not what you were." Moreover, how are we supposed to cultivate the passion flower if all we worship is the seed? And my advice to individuals experiencing what one might call depression, I say to you quite simply that when you choose flight, you know you are flying from yourself. So choose fight. Because you're only fighting yourself, and that's allowed. If you're depressed, and you probably are, why wouldn't you be? That is not you becoming a victim of nature. That is you becoming a warrior within it. You are fighting the very thing we are all put here to fight, your own demons. So be a warrior. And what do warriors do? They worry. Find a problem you can fix and worry about it. Worry is a battle axe. It's heavy as fuck, but if you can swing it right, you'll win. And you find yourself thinking, woe is me. Well, that's the victim mentality invading your shit. And that's what you're fighting. Your own personal victim culture demon. And when you beat it, and you will beat it, once you can acknowledge that you are a warrior, not a victim, it's only a matter of time before you win that fight. And when you do, then you can start to help other people to win their fights. Of course, this is all a footnote on the stark and inescapable fact that we are also fighting against the worldwide ideological institutions that are hell-bent on making people think like victims because of characteristics they can't change, gender, race, so on. So yeah, good luck, society. You're gonna need it. Goodbye and fuck off, I suppose.